Hello, this is NCL Thursday Night Live Spring Training with your NCL player ambassadors. I'm Paul Buonapane, your host. And before we get started, Kate has some things she wants to announce.
Hi, friends. We weren't supposed to be here tonight. We were going to have just these two wonderful gentlemen doing the show by themselves tonight, but WISA's Conference 2020 was canceled to avoid uh, the ever popular concern in the nation of the coronavirus. We've been getting a lot of questions about whether we're still going to run the WISA CTF since NCL is a virtual competition. There won't be anything specific going on this weekend, but I can say that for right now, you do have access to the practice gymnasium if you are a WISIS conference attendee. You should have gotten an email from WISIS on how to register for the gym and register for the WISIS CTF. Just use that link and you can sign in and play in the gym while we sort everything out. We are discussing a lot of options with WISIS, so bear with us. WISIS will announce as soon as we know things. That being said, I'm going to turn it over to these guys who really love web exploitation. I'm going to lurk in the audience and learn some stuff from them. If there's any questions about that kind of stuff, you can post it in the chat. I'll be in the comments hanging out. Paul, you want to take it away?
All right.
Also, can you kick me out because I don't know how to leave?
Yes. All right. So, web application exploitation. We have two blog posts on this that have already been posted, one for beginners and one with some more advanced tips. You can find them on Kate's blog. Yes, the session will be recorded, so you can review it later. If you have a question, post it in the chat. We will mark it and answer them. All right, so are you interested in doing a quick overview? What web application exploitation is?
I can do that. It's literally finding logical bugs in applications that you use in a web browser or have some kind of interface that's generally going over HTTP. WebSockets now is kind of changing things. But so instead of like hacking a traditional program that you would like download and run as an executable or an ELF file, you're connecting to something and you're figuring out bugs that tend to be more along the lines of like issues with input handlings or session handlings, less about memory management or incorrect like storage of things. Although sometimes that gets into things with web apps if you leave a file exposed to the outside world, which you can catch in enumeration.
Right. So web application exploitation is a little bit different from the other categories in that a lot of what you're dealing with is hidden and you don't really have access to it. So in many of the other categories, you're looking at files that you're able to download, you're running programs locally. There may be some unknowns, but you have all the information that you need. With web application exploitation, stuff is often sort of hidden behind the shadows, especially with the more difficult challenges. There's code running on the server that you can't necessarily see. And that can be a little challenging. Another aspect of web application exploitation that can be a little challenging is that there are often multiple technologies involved. There are many choices if you want to run a website. You can use Node, which is JavaScript based for the backend. You might use PHP, you might use ASP.NET. And these technologies take time to learn. And they share a lot of weaknesses, but the specifics are different for each one. So, where should we go from here?
Let's start with enumerations, because that's probably the first thing you're going to want to do.
Yeah.
First thing I always do, like, I go to the website, I just kind of like navigate around it a little, and once I'm done navigating around, I take my preferred tool anymore is GoBuster because it's fairly quick, but I take some kind of like fuzzy directory brute forcer and just like let it run for 10 minutes. I go get something to eat or drink, come back and see what it discovered. And basically what that's going to do for the audiences. It's just going to go through a list of like common URLs and like try it against that domain and see if it returns something back.
So one caveat here is that our challenges that permit scanning are usually, I don't think they're in the web exploitation category. So historically, for most web app exploitation challenges, you cannot use automated tools to scan in NCL. You might be able to use them in the real world, but typically those are, I think they're grouped under scanning for NCL. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
So if you scan with an automated tool, at first you'll get rate limited, and if you continue, you will actually,
Toby's
you'll get in trouble. And it does happen. People do get in trouble for it. If you aren't sure whether something you've written yourself is appropriate to run, first of all, it should be running very slow and be doing something very specific. And you should open a support ticket with Cyber Skyline and ask them before you do it. However, you still need to enumerate, even if you don't use an automated tool. So typically, how would you go about that if you're doing it entirely manually?
Robots and then Firefox and Chrome dev tools kind of have like network traffic things that you can like look at like the traffic as you're like just passively going through, like checking out the website. And then the biggest thing I miss in enumeration is actually looking at the HTML.
Yeah, there's always something that you forget to look at, and it's always where the key piece of information is. So there are hints that will be scattered throughout. Same way it would be in the real world. You're looking for anomalies, something that you recognize as a vulnerability. And typically, so you mentioned robots.txt. That's a good place to start. Looking at the HTML, looking at headers and dev tools. So every modern browser has dev tools that you can pop up, usually by hitting F12 or Control-Shift-I, Control-Option-I or Command-Option-I on macOS. And that will show the network logs, cookies, headers, everything that you need. So I think you and I both prefer that approach, but there are other tools that you can use that do exist, like Zap, Zed Attack Proxy, right?
I know I've used Zap once.
Burp Suite.
Burp's the main one that.
Yeah.
Burp's a lot more usable than Zap in my experience.
I don't particularly like either of them. Anything that you can do with those, you can do manually from the command line in Linux or from DevTools. But those are both valid options. And so once you've done the enumeration, where do we go from there?
You start thinking of common attack vectors. Generally, how I'll do it is I'll think like, if I were designing a web app, where am I most likely to mess up? From past like experiences, and you have to think like, if I have a vulnerability, what would be severe that it would be a challenge? Like, probably getting into a login. Like, something tells me they're going to want me to attack the login, so like I'll start looking for further information on that. I'll think about like some common known vulnerabilities like SQLi, NoSQLi. Maybe there's actually just something hidden in the HTML or the robots where it's like, hey, here's a password, try it.
Right. So for the easier ones, usually it's something more like a password hidden in the HTML, right? Or JavaScript that you can actually see. For the more advanced ones, usually you're looking for places you can actually input information, right? Login forms, search forms, things like that. For a competitive challenge, usually the attack surface is fairly minimal, so you're going to have some idea of what you're supposed to go after. So let's say we find a login form, we start going after it. What are we looking for?
parameters into the request. So like URL parameters, potentially, maybe sessions too. Sessions can be vulnerable. Maybe like the session stuff is calculated based on client side things that like you have control of and the main thing being the payload to the login server. That's what you're gonna like want to modify and mess with the most. Occasionally there might be a login thing just to trick you.
Yeah, that has happened.
Yeah.
The session things have happened. There have been cookies, headers. Everything's fair game. Every season we see something new. So let's take a look at, let's see what we have here for some questions. So here is one from Kate. All right, so we have, what is enumeration?
That's like going through and I should probably like say that in a better worded way. Enumeration.
I can take that one if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
So the first step when you're attacking any sort of application is figuring out what you're dealing with. You want to find every page that you can possibly access, any piece of information that's there. What can you see? Because there's probably a lot that you're not going to be able to see. Whatever's running on the server, you're not going to be able to see that code. So before you even start attacking, you want to look around, get a feel for the website. What does it do? What is the user supposed to do? What would the programmer expect the flow to be? And this is note-taking, generally. Poke around, don't really attack yet, just see what's out there. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's kind of right. That was a really good explanation. Like,
yeah. So if you were using scanning tools, which you're typically not going to be for NCL at least, this is also where you would be using some of those.
Yeah. I thought like other CTFs like that.
Yeah, well, those do exist in NCL. They're just grouped into a different category, so it's easy to get confused. Usually those are under the scanning category. Here's an interesting question. Y'all tried FFUF. Toby has actually commented on that, mentioning fuzzing. I have never heard of FFUF. Ooh. I hear a dog.
Yeah, I have a lot of them. I have 5, and they're demanding food.
Oh, well, they're deprived. Anyway, so for FFUF, I take it's a relatively configurable fuzzer based on Toby's explanation here. Fuzzing tools are usually pretty great, but again, you have to be careful not to attack too fast or too hard in NCL. Pretend you're being stealthy. Pretend they have some sort of security appliance that's going to start throwing alerts if you do something too suspicious. So you want to be stealthy, quiet. If you really need to fuzz something, you can if you're careful about it and slow about it, but it's a little on the risky side and you may want to ask first. Did you pull up what FFUF is?
It's just like, it kind of looked a lot like a tool I mentioned, GoBuster. I mean, it's written in Go, so like it gets my thumbs up because like I like myself some Go.
Go is pretty good for quick tools that need to be performant. All right, what else do we have here for questions?
I think that's all the questions right now.
I think 2 more came up.
Oh, yeah, they have. Oh, a web application in your tool suggests that the application is protected via IDS IPS firewall. What are some of the ways to
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to click the button that says, okay, so now say it.
Okay, got it. When enumerate, English. When enumerating a web application and your tools suggest that the application is protected via IDS IPS firewall, what are some of the ways to evade these protections? I've tried Nmap capabilities, but usually come up short, and that is Circuit Slave. In terms of web apps, specifically, I know like a fuzzer called SQL Map has something called tamper scripts in it, and that's meant to get past WAFs. Firewalls, you're generally not going to get past if they're blocking ports and like stuff like that. I know a lot of boxes will block pings to Nmap from Nmap, so dash capital PN off the top of my head will stop the ping probes. But a lot of the times the answer to that is like, kind of tricky. I know on boxes that have been like boot to roots where like I don't have Nmap capabilities, I try connecting to it with a web browser to see if like it'll allow HTTP traffic and not block my scanning.
Any sort of intrusion detection or prevention usually is only a minor hindrance. It can, in the real world, it can be a problem because you might not want to alert your attacker that you are, or that your target that you're attacking them. In NCL, the equivalent to that is if you are too noisy and you break the rules by scanning, then you get banned from the competition. So generally, there are challenges, some more difficult challenges that do act as though there's a web application firewall or intrusion prevention system, but they always have ways that you can work around them. They're good in terms of you want to have as much security as you can, but if you're copying and pasting things from the web, like SQL injection snippets, it will pick those up usually. But if you actually know SQL and tamper with it a little bit and write your own from scratch, typically it'll go through. It's only looking for the most common things. So there have been some more difficult challenges that involve intrusion detection and prevention and security appliances. And I believe there was one last season that nobody actually managed to solve. And it was a pretty cool challenge. So you may just need to experiment and think out of the box and do some research. Never be afraid to look around the web. MDN is a great resource, Mozilla Developer Network. They have information on all sorts of HTTP protocol features, headers, response codes, etc. So that's my advice. You won't really be using Nmap for the web challenges in NCL. That's not going to help you. There are separate challenges that involve Nmap. Anything to add?
I got a little confused when you said MDN because I confused it with MSDN.
Yeah, I always do the same thing. I always enter the wrong one.
I've been messing with malware a lot lately, so MSDN has been a best friend of mine.
MSDN is great, but not for web app exploitation.
Hey, ASPX.
I suppose.
ASPX, yeah.
But we have yet to encounter an ASP.NET challenge. That might be one for Toby. If we want to torture him, I know he loves C#. All right.
He's not responding to that.
All right. So there are a lot of questions coming in. I might not get them all in order. If you can, instead of typing them in chat, click the Ask a Question button at the bottom. That will make it a little easier for us to answer them. So next question, what are UUIDs and how can they be manipulated to bypass client-side authentication? That's a very specific question.
I know exactly what this is referring to. In that particular challenge, the UUID was not manipulated. It was that it was so UUID is a unique universal identifier. Did I swap the two positions? I might have, but it's an identifier that's generated, and the particular issue with that wasn't that the UUID was manipulated. It's that UUID used a randomness that included time into it, and to be able to reset that account, you use the time at which you created that account, which your UUID told you.
So to generalize this a little bit, concurrency is a problem in web development because you might have servers all over the world. Historically, IDs for various pieces of information were numeric, auto-incrementing, so it would start at 1 and count up. This proved to be problematic as time went on because people can guess those IDs. They can find out information like how many users you have, and it's hard to actually synchronize the action of incrementing a value across the world, especially as networks start to split apart. So one way that we've gone about solving this as an industry is with things like UUIDs, which are 128-bit numbers, essentially, that are in a special format, hexadecimal with some hyphens. And there are measures in place that really make it very difficult to have a collision. So rather than auto-incrementing and making sure nobody else landed on the same ID, you can essentially just generate one and with a reasonable degree of certainty know that it is unique and nobody else in the world has ever generated that same ID. GUIDs are Microsoft's version of this. They're essentially the same thing. So there are a few caveats with this. Some technologies are more likely to use UUIDs than others. So the presence of a UUID tells you a little bit about what technologies they're probably using or not using. For example, MongoDB is more likely than, say, MySQL to use a UUID. The other thing is more modern UUIDs are just completely random numbers, but older UUIDs contain pieces of information, which is what I think you were getting at, right?
Yeah.
It's not completely random. There is a random aspect to it, but it also contains information potentially such as the MAC address of the device and the timestamp. And this was initially meant to decrease the probability of collisions, but it reveals information about the computer that generated it, which isn't ideal. And then later on, we all decided as an industry that that's not even necessary, and a completely random 128-bit number is perfectly fine. There are UUID decoders online that you can use that will give you information that's embedded in a UUID or tell you that that information isn't embedded in the, say, secure UUID.
What's the other questions?
All right. If anyone has asked a question in chat that does not appear in the Ask a Question box, if you wouldn't mind posting it there, because there's been a lot of chat and I haven't read all of it. So the next one that we have in the Ask a Question box is, oh geez, we've got a lot.
They're piling up.
All right. So let's just cover this one very briefly. So it says, so I'm a beginner when it comes to cybersecurity. I have started to learn some stuff on Kali Linux. The question is, for the competition, do we just have to mainly focus on the stuff on Kali Linux and how to use them appropriately, or do we have to focus on some other stuff as well? The answer to that is that Kali is a nice way to get started. It has all the tools you need. You don't need Kali Linux. You can do the entire competition on Windows or Mac OS or Linux. It doesn't matter. But Kali is the typical starting point. There's a lot of resources out there for it. And that includes for web app exploitation challenges. You can use Kali Linux.
Can I add to that?
Yep.
I'm kind of against Kali as a starting point. And here's why. It's just a Linux distribution. You're better off just installing Ubuntu or Debian and then installing the hacking tools yourself, and then because at that point you're learning more about Linux by having to do some basic sysadmin stuff with it, and like two, the only real like you're learning Linux, and two, you're learning more about like the actual stuff that's going into what you're using, not just, oh hey, apt-get this tool. Like, although there are like Metasploit runs their own Debian repository, so you can just apt-get Debian once you add the package, but like you're still having to learn how to add a Debian package at that point in Ubuntu. Like, you can use Windows. I would suggest also having a Linux VM because the binary stuff is generally ELFs, which you can sometimes run on Windows, but like then at that point you're having to deal with I'm forgetting the name of it, but either like WSL or like some kind of
Cygwin.
Cygwin, yeah. I'm gonna say it's not Wine because that's the Linux
the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
The point is, if you can use whatever you want, really. If Kali is what your school curriculum is based around, you may want to start there, but you don't need it. I do not use Kali for NCL, and I don't think I ever have. I'm not a big fan of it, but some people are. Whatever suits you. How do you define fuzzing and what are its uses? I'm going to try to get this one out of the way quickly just because it's not necessarily entirely related to web app exploitation. Fuzzing is just the idea of intelligently making guesses, usually automatically. Usually in the context of web app exploitation, you're looking at URLs or parameters. You're in a script that fuzzes will be looking for changes, different status codes, different headers. It's a very general term for that. So if you're really stuck and you need to try to brute force something a little, it's a way of going about that intelligently rather than just trying every possible combination. But it's a generic term.
Real quick before we move on, Toby wanted me to mention that we should use VMs because safety isolation. There are issues with VMs and like escapes, but they're rare. Keep your stuff updated at that point, and it's good to have an isolation barrier between your normal everyday computing stuff. So, and like this could be malware.
Right. So in general, it's a good practice to do all of NCL in a virtual machine if you can. All right. So let's try and get some more quick ones out of the way. How do you determine which version of SQL is running on the back end of a web server?
There are multiple ways to do this, and they're all fun. My favorite way is if it's like a truly poorly written web app, like they'll enable PHP errors. And if you throw some SQL injection in, I generally just do a comma at first to see if I get a SQL error back. It'll tell you the SQL version. It'll tell you the exact error in your SQL syntax. And like that'll let you know, like, hey, I got SQL. But
any field where you can enter text and submit a form, try a single quote and try a double quote. And typically that will result in an error, and it will give you some idea as to what. If SQL is the target of this challenge, it will usually give you some sort of error that includes the version number.
And you can also use Nmap, but again, if scanning's not allowed, you can't. But Nmap could be used if you want a detailed version number, but SQL injection is handled from the PHP side, not the SQL Server side.
Yes. All right. Let's see what else we have. So we're going off in chat. We're going off on a tangent about isolation. This is a safe competition. It's not going to like wipe your computer, but you should get into the habit of using a virtual machine if you can. I think the worst thing that has ever happened is there was one executable for one challenge where you were supposed to reverse engineer it, but if you ran it, it would tell you it was going to shut down your computer and then count down. And if you didn't exit it in that time, I think it would actually shut down your computer. Does that sound right?
I think that reminds me of another, not NCL challenge I did, but like I was doing a binary exploitation challenge and my shell code was shut down on my local machine. So like I knew every time my machine shut down that my overflow was working.
Yeah. So it's supposed to get you into the habit of doing this in a safe manner. Use a virtual machine. How would you go about stepping through a web app that is using JavaScript for authentication? For example, if JavaScript requires a string of characters and sends it off to be validated by a function, how do you go about stepping around the authentication? Web application exploitation is my weakest area. Do you have any tools that make stepping through JS or other client-side scripting languages easier to digest? So there might be a little confusion here.
Okay. Are you talking about a client-side authentication where the authentication is implemented in the client side, or just some random JS that's sending off to the server? Because
I think I understand where this may be going. So JavaScript has traditionally been a client-side language. It runs in your browser, which means you can step through it in your browser with the dev tools. Recently, that has changed a little bit. It's become common to use JavaScript server-side, which means that for the authentication, typically authentication, the key components of it are happening on the server. You can't step through it. You can't see what that code is. And if the server is running JavaScript on its end, that is JavaScript that you can't see and that you can't step through. There may be a client-side component of it, and you may be able to step through that, but it's probably not going to be too useful. So if it requires a string of characters and sends it off to be validated by a function, there you may be referring to some of the easier challenges that use regular expressions. So some of the challenges focus on learning how to work around client-side validation. And typically the way that's achieved in the real world and in NCL is with regular expressions. So do you want to go into how you might go about
my way of
that?
doing it would be there'd either be reverse engineering it by hand or using something like Z3.
Oh, it's Z3.
It's an SMT solver. So like you define like all of my like it constraint solves. So you're like, my input has to be this, it has to be this, and it has to be this, and then it gives you all the options for it. It's a very cool. It's a very overly complex way of solving something that would probably be easier to just reverse engineer by hand, but like laziness prevails.
If you really need to step through a validation function, you can do that by pressing F12 in your browser, and there's a debugger, and you can set what are called breakpoints. So you would want to search the web for information about setting breakpoints in your browser. My recommendation would be not to really attempt that too much in NCL, because for those challenges for which it works, it's probably going to be on the simpler side, and it will be more educational if you actually go through the code line by line yourself, and try to figure out what it means. And if it's using regular expressions, you will encounter a line that looks like complete gibberish. And that is the regular expression. Lots of symbols like asterisks, plus signs, square brackets. Typically, the whole thing will be surrounded in forward slashes rather than quotes. And not always, but that would be one sign. And that is a language entirely of its own. And that is not specific to JavaScript.
There's a question in the chat that I just saw, and I'm going to answer it. And the answer is yes. It pays to be good at regular expressions. Like yes, you don't have to be amazing at it, but like I can't tell you how helpful it is just like in a random thing to like be able to write out a quick regular expression, because Linux wildcards and regular expressions are both similarly like kind of close, and grep has regexes. So if you're searching for things, it's good to learn like some bare basics of it.
If you get good at them, you will wonder how you lived without them for so long. I use them in everything from writing blog posts to emailing my grandmother. I'm not kidding. They are extremely useful. You can do simple tasks much faster if you have, if you're comfortable with regular expressions. So definitely take some time to learn that. All right. What else do we have here? What are some of your favorite proxy apps?
I think neither of us like proxies.
Yes. I think you'll find that many of the people who have a lot of web development experience tend to use tools that are oriented more toward web development rather than web application exploitation. Those are the tools we're comfortable with. We know how to use them. They work well. Usually that excludes proxies. So I have used Burp Suite and I have used Zap. I have not been particularly impressed with either of them. I can work faster in other tools. I think those are the two big ones that people usually throw out there.
Fiddler, if you're a Windows person, I know a lot of people really like Fiddler. I will say, if I had to use a proxy, if you're like, you have to use a proxy to solve this, I'd use Burp. Because I hated Zap. Burp is just better. I hate to say that because Zap's open source, but like Burp's it's just better.
It's really a matter of personal preference. All of these tools are perfectly capable of solving pretty much all of the challenges. We use the tools with which we're familiar.
Yeah.
Pick one, learn it, and you'll be fine. So to anyone who's just joining us, this video is recorded and you will be able to view it later. So what did you not like about Zap? Personally, I just don't like the fact that it's a GUI. I like to be able to write a script and run it in Bash or CSH or whatever. Just
mine was
force of habit.
It just felt counterintuitive compared to like Burp and Firefox's dev tools. Burp, I had like the left click send to like whatever function I wanted, and I could mess with it there. Or repeater, I could send it to repeater and then mess around with it there. Firefox dev tools, I could get it, edit, and send requests. I didn't find a good way to do that in Zap. Zap had like a lot of really weird controls, and I was just like, I can use Firefox dev tools.
They're capable tools, but if you're really intimately familiar with the HTTP protocol, typically it's just easier to use something that's a little closer to that, just because you feel the need to mess with the raw data.
I love Python and requests.
That being said, as HTTP 2 makes more headway and things like WebSockets make more headway, it will become increasingly hard for you and me to use stuff like curl to solve these challenges. We'll need to use stuff like DevTools more, and to fill in the gaps, we may need to start using proxies more often.
I'll be interested to see with WebSockets. I've talked to some web people, and the general consensus of WebSockets is we're waiting for some good tooling.
Yeah, there isn't a whole lot of tooling, but we may see some hard challenges that involve WebSockets eventually. All right. Let's see. So to answer, so what about Burp? Burp is a GUI. Same reason as Zap, roughly, right? It's just not an interface we're accustomed to.
I can feel the Burp questions because, like, I've used Burp a bit. Burp is Burp is a collection of like, it's a suite. It's even called Burp Suite. It's like,
Yeah.
instead of like trying to do one thing and do it well, it's like, I'm going to try and do all the things as good as I can. And it does that mainly by being a proxy. So you can think of a proxy like, I'm trying to think if I have anything on my desk that could make this more interesting as a prop. So I have this. So like, say that I'm trying to throw this data to the server, and like I do it from my hand to my hand. The data goes across. A proxy is something that stands in the middle and then forwards it back and forth, and it just acts as a relay. Burp allows you to then analyze the traffic going from your web browser to the server, and then mess with it, fiddle around with it, resend it, stuff like that. And it does it in a nice graphical way instead of a command line.
Yeah.
No offense to
It's really just a matter of personal preference at the moment. There will probably come a day in which the tooling that you and I use is insufficient and we need to switch to tools like Burp. But currently, there's no difference, really. It's just what you're comfortable with. So in Burp Suite, what examples of how the different tabs, intruder, spider, repeater, etc., can be used to fuzz web applications?
I'm pretty sure that of those, only intruder does fuzzing, I believe.
I think repeater, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think repeater may be able to.
Repeater might have some capabilities where you can script repeater, but repeater by default is not like a fuzzer. Repeater is just something that you can take. It's basic. Repeater is like the Firefox dev tool equivalent of edit and resend.
Manual fuzzing.
Yeah, manual fuzzing, but
which is usually what you're going to be using for NCL web app challenges anyway. In general, Spider is not going to be useful in NCL, I think you'll get rate limited with that, typically. You do have to be careful with these tools. They have a lot of functionality that it's easy to click a button and accidentally do something you're not supposed to for a particular challenge.
Big red blow up button.
Yeah, so they are noisy unless you're careful. All right. How about web extensions? Do you have a list of favorites or do you use any? Yeah, I use an ad blocker.
HTTPS everywhere, LastPass. In the terms of actually like
NCL?
Yeah.
Some web frameworks have extensions that are useful. Like I know React has one that I've used for debugging React applications.
I've used that once or twice, I think.
I used to use Firebug, but I don't think it's necessary anymore.
Firefox DevTools has gotten
Yeah,
really good.
It works fine.
There's a built-in IDE to Firefox anymore.
Yeah, I like Chrome's DevTools a little better than Firefox's or Safari's, but Safari's is up there. Yeah. So I don't personally really use any extensions. The one thing that I know there is one that I've used for, I want to say certain kinds of like REST requests that make it a little easier to deal with. I think it's mostly ASP.NET related. But generally, extensions are a little risky. You never quite know what they're going to do, and there are a lot of extensions out there that are malicious. So I try to avoid them.
The questions keep piling up.
Firebug is discontinued, isn't it? I think so, but that doesn't keep people from referring to Firefox DevTools as Firebug oftentimes. You still see that in code sometimes. So I'm never quite sure if it's actually dead because people keep referencing it. But I don't think people really use it directly anymore. All right, so this one has a lot of upvotes. but it's going to take a long time to answer.
Kate's one or the one below it?
Kate's one. What resources do you recommend for newbies in the NCL games, specifically for web application exploitation?
Oh, there's a question under that that's asking kind of the same thing too.
Well, we'll start with this one.
Yeah.
I don't think I can mark multiple at the same time.
For web apps, there's a book that everyone on the Slack is calling the Web App Bible, and I kind of agree. I'm going to paste the Amazon link into the chat right now.
Can you just do the ISBN instead of the Amazon link? Just for
the ISBN. Okay, I'm going to have fun now trying to find the ISBN.
If you want to use Amazon, you can enter in directly into their search, and it will show the book.
They're ISBN 13 or 10. Which one do you prefer?
You got approval to post the Amazon link.
I did? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to say that. Here's the Amazon link. It's the Web Application Hacker's Handbook. It's one that, if anyone's familiar with Humble Bundle, they do ebook bundles with cybersecurity, and you can generally get a lot of these for fairly cheap in a legal way. It's a really good book. It covers a lot of things. It's fairly up to date. Yeah, that's a good starting point.
Personally, I find that it's easier to start learning web development than it is to go directly to the security side of things. Take some time, learn different technologies. It's a steep learning curve. It's hard to learn web development. But I personally think that's actually easier for that particular category than going directly into the security side of things. There are categories where you really don't need any development knowledge. But it will make your life a lot easier, and you'll be able to advance faster in the security side. That's not to say that learning development will teach you security. There are a lot of developers who don't know anything about web security.
Sometimes quite the opposite, depending on where you're learning it from.
Right.
But that's a really good point.
Once you get into development, the doors will sort of open, and the learning curve will be a lot shallower, at least for that category. So to that extent, where would you find beginner web developer resources?
You already said the Mozilla docs.
Yeah, MDN is great.
I think it's like Tutorial Points has a lot of stuff about web development. I don't want to say learn PHP because I have a personal gripe with PHP.
If you want to go into security for web application development or web application exploitation, PHP is probably going to be on the list. There's a lot of PHP out there.
You should learn PHP. Whether you'll like using PHP or not, you should learn it. I diss on it. It's not the worst language I've ever used. But learn yourself some PHP. Set up like your generally people use a LAMP stack. So like Linux, Apache for the web server, MySQL for the database in PHP. Set that up. You're going to learn Linux, you're going to learn web server configuration, you're going to learn PHP, and you'll learn your database. And that'll be a great starting point for you to start diving into security, because each one of those can have misconfigurations and vulnerabilities in its own.
So one thing I do want to point out is that web development is a very broad topic, and different people have different ideas of what constitutes web development. And sorry, Ed, I don't mean to pick on you, but you said learn PHP if you want to do WordPress. I do want to point out that if your goal is to ultimately get into security, building onto existing applications like making WordPress add-ons, or I think WordPress calls them plugins, probably isn't the best way to get started with the security side of things. There's already a lot of security infrastructure in place, and there aren't really going to be any people checking the security of your code. A large number of very popular WordPress plugins have major vulnerabilities. If your goal is to get into security rather than make a website, Try to do as much from scratch as you can and experiment with different technologies. You'll learn a lot more about the aspects that relate to security. All right, so we have MDN, we have books, tutorial point you mentioned. This is something on which you can take classes. So sometimes it's hard to find actual security classes. Web development is something for which there are lots of classes all over the place. I strongly recommend taking an in-person class if you like human interaction and that tends to be how you learn. Go for that. Personally, that's what I find easiest.
And definitely set up the stack yourself. There are like apps that you can just click a button and it's magic and does your web server for you. Set it up yourself. You will learn so much more.
Yes, don't use something like cPanel. You can use it to start, but you want to dive in and learn the ins and outs of the whole system, which means doing everything from scratch. And it is painful initially. And it's really tempting to use something like cPanel or WordPress or Drupal or I think Webmin is another one. PHPMyAdmin.
Docker
avoid them if you can. Yeah.
I say that as an avid Docker.
And I say this specifically as it relates to security. You will learn more about the inner workings of these technologies.
Also, if you can, try and use Nginx. It's a lot nicer to configure than Apache in my experience.
Although that has its own caveats. When you have thousands of lines of Nginx configuration, you start to uncover some easy ways to misconfigure it in a way that makes it very vulnerable. All right, so let's go on to the next one here. Is there an intro for beginners? I am in IT and know zero cyber stuff. What software programs should I start off with learning? My recommendation for that would be don't start with web application exploitation unless you have prior web development experience. So for you, I would say at the top of this Crowdcast window, you'll see there it says in small text, schedule session 7 of 13. If you click that, there's a full list of all the episodes we've done already. And after this is over, I would strongly recommend checking those out and looking at some of the categories like open source intelligence. And do we have any for encryption? Encryption would be another good one. Yes, as Kate said, you can also access last season's shows. They're not live, obviously, but they've been they've been recorded.
Oh,
they were recorded live. They are no longer live.
Bless
you
can
access them and learn more about topics that are a little easier to get started with. Do you have anything to add to that?
I actually like web development as a starting point. It's kind
I do too.
I started in binary exploitation for like security stuff.
That's a hard one to. That's the worst one to get started.
My recommend, like I am very much the like jump off the bridge and hope that whatever clothes you're wearing work as a parachute. But like there are easier categories. But like
I got started in web application exploitation. You can do it, but unless you have prior web development experience, it's not the easiest route.
It's not, but kind of the whole force you to learn thing.
If you want, go for it, but you're going to need a lot of resources, a lot of books.
Google is your friend.
Google is your friend, or DuckDuckGo if you prefer that. This is not to scare you away from web application exploitation. It is by far my favorite category. However, if you're really lost and aren't sure where to get started, that's probably one of the categories to come back to. So, any suggestions, methodologies for AWS or MongoDB focused challenges? So, I got to say that again. Any suggestions or methodologies for AWS or MongoDB focused challenges? So we can't go into the specifics of previous challenges. However, in general, do you want to attack that one? No pun intended.
Not not going into total specifics. I will name a service. There's this thing called S3. It's known for having publicly exposed stuff that shouldn't be publicly exposed because of misconfigurations. In AWS, get yourself a developer account, which all you need is a credit or debit card and an email. And it's not because they're going to charge you. They're going to give you a free tier, which gives you a lot of access. The card's there in case you reach your rate limits.
You do have to be careful, though, because they will charge you if you exceed the free tier.
Yeah. Just don't spin up any VM. Well, they actually do have free VMs, but like don't spin up any like high GPU processing powers. Don't run your Hashcat instance on AWS unless you want to pay some money. What was the other part? It was like AWS and then Mongo.
Can we go a little bit more into S3?
S3
what's the issue with that, and how do you go about attacking it?
Okay, so S3 is Amazon's like it's simple storage.
Simple storage service.
Simple storage service. So the problem with like S3 has these things called buckets, and buckets hold information, which is files. And the trick is by default for a while. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I could be wrong. That or
it was never the default. People just misconfigure it.
I thought it was default for a while. That or it was like
not really.
Or I remember when you go to set up an S3 bucket, it's like, hey, you should really do this, and then people are like, I don't want to take the time. So what that does is it means that anyone that has an S3 developer account can access your buckets, and people put things that shouldn't be publicly accessible in these buckets. And you can find them using there's actually tools that search all S3 buckets now, but that's for a different, that'd be more of like OSINT and less S3 exploitation. Specifically, there's a command line tool called like AWS has its own command line tool, and from that has a sub tool that's like S3, and you can use that to query buckets.
Right.
That's as far as I can go, I think.
S3 is meant to store files in a distributed manner when you have a cloud application. Lots of companies use it. It's very popular. If it's been misconfigured and all the files are public in a bucket, you can access them on the web. And you'll see, like, you might right-click on an image and view image URL or something on a website, and you'll see that it's like s3.amazonaws.com/something, and the something after that is the bucket. And that tells you that it's on S3 and that the file is public, which means there are probably a lot of other public files on there that might be interesting, and some of them might not be stuff you're supposed to see. So if you're doing something like NCL, where you have permission to view said files, you can even, in just a web browser, oftentimes view a full list of the files. It'll truncate after 1,000, I think. But you can read the documentation on S3 and find ways to get around that if you need to. But you'll get this nice XML list of all the files, and you can scroll through it and try to find something interesting. The best way to go about it is the command line tool. AWS has their own command line tool, which you mentioned. It has an S3 subcommand that lets you do a little more than you would be able to intuitively do in a web browser. It has good documentation. You don't actually need an account. There's a flag that you can add to avoid that. I forget what it is, but it's in the documentation. And it allows you to view all the files, download all the files potentially. S3 has a tendency to save old versions of files, even if they've been deleted or changed. that's pretty useful. You can access those via the command line tool as well. I don't want to get too much more specific than that, but those would be the general attack vectors for any application that uses S3.
My only S3 addition would be that there's another subcommand called S3 API that's a little more low level and is very helpful.
I forgot about that. That's useful.
And then for Mongo, Mongo is definitely read the documentation. Like very helpful things in this. This is not just Mongo, but any NoSQL SQL database, just any database software. There are commands that'll let you just view all of like the databases, view tables, yada yada yada. Use those, find things, query those things. You'll probably get lucky and find something.
Whenever you're dealing with a database and you stumbled upon MongoDB, just stick MongoDB injection into a search engine, and you'll find white papers, you'll find blog posts, people who have tried different things and it's worked for them. You can attempt some of those. For something like MongoDB, most of the injection resources out there are for SQL, but for MongoDB, which is a little newer and a little less traditional, injection does exist, but you may need to think outside the box a little bit and do some research as you're solving the challenge. All right, let's do the dir search one. I don't personally use dir search, so I can't answer that. Have you ever used it?
I use GoBuster and Derb if I'm having to do stuff like that. So like I've never used it. Creature of habit tools that I've used. A lot of
there are a lot of tools that do the same things. You just get used to certain ones and end up using those. My suggestion would be, if it's a tool that has extensions, try all the different extensions. See what happens. You might want to try that before the challenge, or if you're in something like the gym or preseason, maybe you can get a little adventurous.
Speaking of the trying out, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Circuit Slave, who's been fairly active in the chat, and like he posted some stuff about some like web app boxes. Like that was awesome. Like those resources are good, and big thanks for doing that.
All right, we have one more question that I'm not sure how to go about answering. I have no idea. Did it at all?
JavaScript's just kind of a mess
all right,
in its
so
history. That's the question.
I am probably butchering this pronunciation. I am not good with Chinese pronunciation, so I apologize. How did the Yuan dynasty influence JavaScript? Anyone who can correct my pronunciation, please do so. And the answer is, I have no idea if it did. All right. Okay. So do we have any more questions that we missed in chat?
I don't know.
So I think we've already been going for an hour. So Kate has just sent us a reminder. So next week's show, I believe, is covering the NCL Gym and RE, which I assume means reverse engineering. Did I get that right, Kate?
Yep. I think. I remember because I put it in my calendar.
We have some ambiguous acronyms. So I believe we're covering the gym and reverse engineering.
I'll be on.
And are you and I both back next week?
Are you? I know I am.
I think I am. I need to check.
I'm looking forward to that. Reverse engineering is my favorite thing to do.
Reverse engineering is fun. Challenging and time consuming, but a lot of fun.
That's why it's fun. It's time consuming.
So join us next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and we will cover the gym and reverse engineering. And while we are on that topic, where is it? So, as you may be aware, there's only about a week left for this season's registration. If you haven't already sorted out your registration, don't wait until the last minute. Now's the time to do so. Exactly a week from today, the NCL gym opens. So get a head start on that. All right. And with that, I think, are we ready to sign off? Anything else we need to address?
I don't think so.
All right.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Yeah. Bye.